The King of Elfland's Daughter by Lord Dunsay. Part 7. Chapter 14. The Quest for the Elfin Mountains. Winter descended on Earl and gripped the forest, holding the small twigs stiff and still. In the valley it silenced the stream, and in the fields of the oxen the grass was as brittle as earthenware, and the breath of the beasts went up like smoke of encampments. And Orion still went to the woods whenever Oth would take him, and sometimes he went with Threll. When he went with Oth, the wood was full of the glamour of the beasts that Oth hunted, and the splendour of the great stags seemed to haunt the gloom of far hollows. But when he went with Threll, a mystery haunted the woods, so that one could not say what creature might not appear, nor what haunted and hid by every enormous bole. What beasts there were in the wood even Threll did not know. Many kinds fell to his subtlety, but who knew if these were all? And when the boy was late in the wood on happy evenings, he would always hear as the sun went blazing down rank on rank of the elfin horns blowing far away eastward in the chill of the coming dusk, very far and faint like reveille heard in dreams. From beyond the woods they sounded, all those ringing horns, from beyond the downs, far over the furthest curve of them, and he knew them for the silver horns of Elfland. In all other ways he was human, and but for his power to hear those horns of Elfland, whose music rings but a yard beyond human hearing, and his knowledge of what they were, but for these two things he was as yet no more than a human child. And how the horns of Elfland blew over the barrier of twilight to be heard by any ear in the fields we know, I cannot understand, yet Tennyson speaks of them as heard faintly blowing, even in these fields of ours, and I believe that by accepting all that the poets say while duly inspired, our errors will be fewest. So, though science may deny or confirm it, Tennyson's lines shall guide me here. Alveric in those days went through the village of Earl with his thoughts far from there, moodily, and he stopped at many doors and spoke and planned, with his eyes always fixed as it seemed on things no one else could see. He was brooding on far horizons, and the last over which was Elfland, and from house to house he gathered a little band of men. It was Alveric's dream to find the frontier further north, to travel on over the fields we know, always searching new horizons, till he came to some place from which Elfland had not ebbed. To this he determined to dedicate his days. When Lirazel was with him among the fields, we know his thoughts had ever been to make her more earthly, but now that she was gone, the thoughts of his own mind were becoming daily more elvish, and folk began to look sideways at his fantastic mien. Dreaming always of Elfland and of elfish things, he gathered horses and provender and made for his little band so huge a store of provisions that those who saw it wondered. Many asked to be of that curious band, and few would go with him to haunt horizons when they heard whither he went. And the first that he found to be of that band was a lad that was crossed in love, and then a young shepherd, well used to lonely spaces, then one that had heard a curious song that someone sang one evening. It had set his thoughts roving away to impossible lands, and so he was well content to follow his fancies. One huge full moon one summer had shone all a warm night long on a lad as he lay in the hay, and after that he had guessed or seen things that he said the moon showed him. Whatever they were, none else saw any such things in Earl. He also joined Elveric's band as soon as he asked him. It was many days before Elveric found these four, and more he could not find, but a lad that was quite witless, and he took him to tend the horses, for he understood horses well, and they understood him, though no human man or woman could make him out at all, except his mother, who wept when Elveric had his promise to go, for she said that he was the prop and support of her age, and knew what storms would come, and when the swallows would fly, and what colours the flowers would come up from seeds she sowed in her garden, and where the spiders would build their webs, and the ancient fables of flies. She wept and said that many there would be more things lost by his going than ever folk guessed in Earl. But Elveric took him away. Many go thus. And one morning 6 horses, heaped and hung with provisions all round their saddles, waited at Elveric's gateway with the 5 men that were to roam with him as far as the world's edge. He had taken long counsel with Zero-on-the-Rel, but she said that no magic of hers had the power to charm Elfland or to cross the dread will of its king. He therefore commended Orion to her care, knowing well that though hers was but simple or earthly magic, yet no magic likely to cross the fields we know, nor curse nor rune directed against his boy, would be able to thwart her spell. And for himself, he trusted to the fortune that waits at the end of long weary journeys. To Orion he spoke long, not knowing how long that journey might be before he again found Elfland, nor how easily he might return across the frontier of twilight. He asked the boy what he desired of life. "To be a hunter," said he. "What will you hunt while I am over the hills?" said his father. "Stags, like oath," said Orion. Elveric commended that sport, for he himself loved it. "And some day I will go a long way over the hills and hunt stranger things," said the boy. "What kinds of things?" asked Elveric, but the boy did not know. His father suggested different kinds of beasts. "No, stranger than them," said Orion, "stranger even than bears." "But what will they be?" asked his father. "Magic things," said the boy. But the horses moved restlessly down below in the cold, so that there was no time for more idle talk, and Elveric said farewell to the witch and his son and strode away, thinking little of the future, for all was too vague for thought. Elveric mounted his horse over the heaps of provisions, and all the band of 6 men rode away. The villagers stood in the street to see them go. All knew their curious quest, and when all had saluted Elveric and all had called their farewells to the last of the riders, a hum of talk arose, and in the talk was contempt of Elveric's quest, and pity, and ridicule, and sometimes affection spoke and sometimes scorn, yet in the hearts of all there was envy, for their reason mocked the lonely roving of that outlandish adventure, but their hearts would have gone. And away rode Elveric out of the village of Earl with his company of adventurers behind him, a moonstruck man, a madman, a lovesick lad, a shepherd boy and a poet. And Elveric made Vand, the young shepherd, the master of his encampment, for he deemed him to be the sanest amongst his following. But there were disputes at once as they rode, before they came to make any encampment, and Elveric, hearing or feeling the discontent of his men, learned that on such a quest as his it was not the sanest but the maddest that should be given authority. So he named Niv, the witless lad, the master of his encampment, and Niv served him well till a day that was far thence, and the moonstruck man stood by Niv, and all were content to do the bidding of Niv, and all honoured Elveric's quest. And many men in numerous lands do saner things with less harmony. They came to the uplands, and rode over the fields, and rode till they came to the furthest hedges of men, and to the houses that they had built at the verge, beyond which even their thoughts refused to fare. Through this line of houses at the edge of those fields, 4 or 5 in every mile, Alveric went with his queer company. The leather worker's hut was far to the south. Now he turned northward to ride past the banks of the houses, over fields through which once the barrier of twilight had run, till he should find some place where Elfland might seem not to have ebbed so far. He explained this to his men, and the leading spirits, Niv and Zend, who was moonstruck, applauded at once, and Thil, the young dreamer of songs, and the scheme was a wise one too, and Vand was carried away by the keen zeal of these 3, and it was all one to Rannoch the lover. And they had not gone far along the banks of the houses when the red sun touched the horizon, and they hastened to make an encampment by what remained of the light of the short winter's day. And Niv said that they would build a palace like those of kings, and the idea fired Zen to work like 3 men, and Thil helped eagerly, and they set up stakes and stretched blankets upon them and made a wall of brushwood, for they were but just outside the hedgerows, and Vand helped too with rough hurdles, and Rannoch toiled on wearily, and when all was finished, Niv said that it was a palace, and Elveric went in and rested while they lit a fire outside, and Van cooked a meal for them all, which he did every day for himself upon lonely downs, and none could have cared for the horses better than Niv. And as the gloaming faded away, the cold of winter grew, and by the time that the first star shone there, seemed nothing in the night but bitter cold. Yet Elveric's men lay down by their fire in their leathers and furs and slept, all but Rannoch the lover. To Elveric, lying on furs in his shelter, watching red embers glowing beyond dark shapes of his men, the quest promised well. He would go far north, watching every horizon for any sign of Elfland. He would go by the borders of the fields we know, and always be near provisions, and if he got no glimpse of the pale blue mountains, he would go on till he found some field from which Elfland had not ebbed, and so come round behind them. And Niv and Zend and Thil all had sworn to him that evening that before many days were gone, they would surely all find Elfland. Upon this thought he slept. Chapter 15. The Retreat of the Elf King. When Lyrazil blew away with the splendid leaves, they dropped one by one from their dance in the gleaming air and ran on over the fields for a while, and then gathered by hedgerows and rested. But earth that pulls all things down had no hold on her, for the rune of the King of Elfland had crossed its borders, calling her home. So she rode carelessly the great northwest wind, looking down idly on the fields we know as she swept over them homewards. No grip had earth on her any longer at all, for with her weight, which is where earth holds us, were gone all her earthly cares. She saw without grief old fields wherein she and Elveric walked once. They drifted by. She saw the houses of men. These also passed, and deep and dense and heavy with colour, she saw the border of Elfland. A last cry earth called to her with many voices, a child shouting, rooks cawing, the dull lowing of cows, a slow cart heaving home. Then she was into the denser barrier of twilight, and all earth's sounds dimmed suddenly. She was through it, and they ceased. Like a tired horse falling dead, our northwest wind dropped at the frontier, for no winds blow in Elfland that roam over the fields we know. And Lirazel slanted slowly onwards and down till her feet were back again on the magical soil of her home. She saw full fair the peaks of the Elfin mountains, and dark underneath them the forest that guarded the Elf King's throne. Above this forest were, glimmering even now, great spires in the elven morning, which glows with more sparkling splendour than do our most dewy dawns, and never passes away. Over the elfin land the elfin lady passed with her light feet, touching the grasses as thistledown touches them when it comes down to them, and brushes their crests, while a languid wind rolls it slowly over the fields we know. And all the elvish and fantastic things, and the curious aspect of the land, and the odd flowers and the haunted trees, and the ominous boding of magic that hung in the air, were all so full of memories of her home that she flung her arms about the first gnarled gnome-like trunk and kissed its wrinkled bark. And so she came to the enchanted wood, and the sinister pines that guarded it, with the watchful ivy leaning over their branches, bowed to Lirazel as she passed. Not a wonder in that wood, not a grim hint of magic, but brought back the past to her as though it had scarcely gone. It was, she felt, but yesterday morning that she'd gone away, and it was yesterday morning still, as she passed through the woods, and the gashes of Alvric's sword were yet fresh and white on the trees. And now a light began to glow through the wood, then flash upon flash of colours, and she knew they shone from the glory and splendour of flowers that girdled the lawns of her father. To these she came again, and her faint footprints that she had made as she left her father's palace, and wondered to see Alveric there, were not yet gone from the bended grass and the spiders' webs and the dew. There the great flowers glowed in the elfin light, while beyond them twinkled and flashed, with the portal through which she had left it still open wide to the lawns, the place that may not be told of but only in song. Thither Lirazel returned, and the Elf King, who heard by magic the tread of her soundless feet, was before his door to meet her. His great beard almost hid her as they embraced. He had sorrowed for her long through that elfin morning. He had wondered, despite his wisdom. He had feared, for all his runes. He had yearned for her as human hearts may yearn, for all that he was of magic stock dwelling beyond our fields. And now she was home again, and the elfin morning brightened over leagues of Elfland with the old King Elf's joy, and even a glow was seen upon the slopes of the elfin mountains. And through the flash and the glimmer of the vast doorway they passed into the palace once more. The knight of the Elf King's guard saluted with his sword as they went, but dared not turn his head after Lirazel's beauty. They came again to the hall of the Elf King's throne, which is made of rainbows and ice, and the great king seated himself and looked at Lirazel on his knee, and a calm came down upon Elfland. And for long through the endless elfin morning nothing troubled that calm. Lirazel rested after the cares of earth, and the Elf King sat there keeping the deep content in his harp. The knight of the guard remained at the salute, his sword's point downward still. The palace glowed and shone. It was like a scene in some deep pool beyond the sound of city, with green reeds and gleaming fishes, and myriads of tiny shells all shining in the twilight on deep water, which nothing has disturbed through all the long summer's day. And thus they rested beyond the fret of time, and the hours rested around them, as the little leaping waves of a cataract rest when the ice calms the stream. The serene blue peaks of the elfin mountains above them stood like unchanging dreams. Then, like the noise of some city heard amongst birds in the wood, like a sob heard among children that are all met to rejoice, like laughter among company that weep, like a shrill wind in orchards amongst the early blossom, like a wolf coming over the downs where the sheep are asleep, there came a feeling into the Elf King's mood that one was coming towards them across the fields of earth. It was Elveric with his sword of thunderbolt iron, which somehow the old king sensed by its flavour of magic. Then the Elf King rose and put his left arm about his daughter and raised his right hand to make a mighty enchantment, standing up before his shining throne, which is the very centre of Elfland. And with clear resonance deep down in his throat, he chanted a rhythmic spell, and made of words that Lirazel had never heard before, some age-old incantation, calling Elfland away, drawing it further from earth, and the marvellous flowers heard as their petals drank in the music, and the deep notes flooded the lawns, and all the palace thrilled and quivered with brighter colours. And a charm went over the plain as far as the frontier of twilight, and a trembling went through the enchanted wood. Still the Elf King chanted on. The ringing ominous notes came now to the elfin mountains, and all their line of peaks quivered as hills in the haze, when the heat of summer beats up from the moors and visibly dances in the air. All Elfland heard and all Elfland obeyed that spell, and now the king and his daughter drifted away as the smoke of the nomads drifts over Sahara, away from their camel's hair tents, as dreams drift away at dawn, as clouds over the sunset, and like the wind with the smoke, night with the dreams, warmth with the sunset, all Elfland drifted with them. All Elfland drifted with them and left the desolate plain, the dreary, deserted region, the unenchanted land. So swiftly that the spell was uttered, so suddenly Elfland obeyed, that many a little song, old memory, garden or may tree of remembered years was swept but a little way by the drift and heave of Elfland, swaying too slowly eastward till the elfin lawns were gone, and the barrier of twilight heaved over them and left them among the rocks. And whither Elfland went I cannot say, nor even whether it followed the curve of the earth or drifted beyond our rocks out into the twilight. There had been an enchantment near to our fields, and now there was none. Wherever it went, it was far. Then the Elf King ceased to chant, and all was accomplished. As silently as, in a moment that no one can determine, the long layers over the sunset turned from gold to pink, or from a glowing pink to a listless unlit colour, all Elfland left the edges of those fields by which its wonder had lurked for the long ages of men, and was away now whither I know not. And the Elf King seated himself again on his throne of mist and ice, in which charmed rainbows were, and took Lirazel his daughter again on his knee, and the calm that his chanting had broken came back heavy and deep over Elfland. Heavy and deep it fell on the lawns, heavy and deep on the flowers. Each dazzling blade of grass was still in its little curve, as though nature, in a moment of mourning, said, "Hush," at the sudden end of the world. And the flowers dreamed on in their beauty, immune from autumn or wind. Far over the moors of the trolls slept the calm of the King of Elfland, where the smoke from the queer habitations hung stilled in the air, and the forest wherein it quieted the trembling of myriads of petals on roses. It stilled the pools where the great lilies towered, till they and their reflections slept on in one gorgeous dream. And there below, motionless fronds of dream-gripped trees, on the still water, dreaming of the still air, where the huge lily leaves floated green in the calm, was the troll, Luraloo, sitting upon a leaf. For thus they named in Elfland the troll that had gone to Earl. He sat there gazing into the water at a certain impudent look that he had on. He gazed and gazed and gazed. Nothing stirred, nothing changed. All things were still, reposing in the deep content of the king. The knight of the guard brought his sword back to the carry, and afterwards stood as still as his perpetual post as some suit of armour whose owner is centuries dead. And still the king sat silent with his daughter upon his knee, his blue eyes unmoving as the pale blue peaks, which through wide windows shone from the elfin mountains. And the elf king stirred not, nor changed, but held to that moment in which he had found content, and laid its influence over all his dominions, for the good and welfare of Elfland. For he had, what all our troubled world with all its changes seeks, and finds so rarely, and must at once cast away, he had found content and held it. And in that calm that settled down upon Elfland, there passed 10 years over the fields we know. End of part 7. If you have been enjoying this audiobook, please take the time to subscribe. It would really help the station. If you could also like or leave a comment or share this station with other friends, that would be great. Thank you.